All right, so in our last lecture, we discussed how the stock market works. We discussed why people might invest in the stock market, why people would purchase stocks in certain companies, how a company's value rises and falls. We talked about the fact that how they measure the stock market as a whole and how the NASDAQ measures the top 3,000 companies in America. The S&P tracks the top 500 and the Dow Jones tracks the top 30 companies, and how they measure the score of the United States economy based on how well individual companies are doing. We discussed how a company's value can increase because of there's potential for the company to do well and a lot of hype, but if a company's value, stock values rise too high and the actual value of the company doesn't match it, we talked about how that's called a bubble, and how eventually bubbles have to burst. And unfortunately, what happens with the economy as a whole is sometimes you see a massive bubble occur in the entire economy, and that's when you have a stock market crash. And last time we took a look real quickly at how the stock market crash doesn't actually cause a Great Depression. It's a symptom that would indicate that there's something wrong with the economy, and if you don't react to the crash properly, the economy can get worse. And so we compared it to getting a sore throat and coming down with a common cold. Now, what we want to take a look at this time is we want to take a look at specifically what happened in the 1920s. So for example, when we talked about this last time, we talked about sometime around 1925, the demand for American goods started to level off. Americans can only purchase so many washing machines, radios, Model Ts, and all of those types of luxury items. And so while the value of the American economy was tapering off in the 1925 through 1929, the actual value of American stocks was drastically increasing. In fact, when you take a look at it, Wall Street continuously rose for 8 straight years from 1921 to 1929. And from those years, 1925 to 1929, where we talk about the fact that the American economy was starting to actually level off, the value of stocks was actually tripling during that period of time. And so what we see is a massive bubble was occurring in the American stock markets as a whole, and Americans were continuously investing, which was creating a massive bubble. And so what we want to take a look at here today is, real quick, how Americans were investing in the 1920s. So for example, if you invest in the stock market, and we talked about this in class before the school was closed, the safest way to invest in the stock market is to take your money, spread it out over over massive parts of the stock market, and then leave it in there. So for example, when you ask somebody, what would you do if you won the lottery? And you hear somebody tell you, well, if I won the lottery, I would invest that money and I'd never work again. Well, you ever wonder how exactly that happens? When you take a look at the safest way to invest your money in the stock market is to take your money, spread it all over the markets in various different safe places, and then just simply keep your money there. So when you invest your money in the stock market, for example, the way that a company's stock structure is designed when it hits the markets is that that company is required to pay back annual dividends to its investors. What that means is every year, some companies do it 3 times a year, some companies do it 4 times a year, some companies do it twice a year, some companies do it once a year. Companies will pay back a percentage of how much stock you own. So let's say, for example, if I own the Apple Corporation, and this is purely for example's sake, it works a little bit differently than this, but if you invest in a company, the company will annually pay back, let's say, 1% of its stock in dividends a year. So for example, if you own $10,000 worth of stock in a company and it pays you back once a year, 1% of your value, you'd get a check for $100 a year. And as long as you hold on to that stock, you'll continue to collect dividend payments. But let's say, for example, you hit the lottery for $10 million and you invest your money in that stock in a company, and then you just simply let your money sit in there and you collect the dividends a year. Well, 1% of a $10 million stock is $100,000 now. So this is why when you hear somebody say, if I hit the lottery, I'd simply invest the money and then never work again. What they're talking about is they take that money, 10 million, you hit the Powerball, you win 100 million or anything like that. You invest it all over the stock markets, you leave that money in there and then you never take it out and you just live off the dividends for the rest of your life. That's how that would work. Once again, the safest way to invest your money is to spread it all over the stock market in various different safe places and then simply leave it there. This is essentially an oversimplified version, essentially kind of how a lot of retirement plans work. You put money into your 401k or your 403b, your Roth IRA. That money is put into various different places and it is spread out throughout the markets. And that way, because your money is spread all over the place, even if the stock market does crash, you will lose money in your retirement for the time being. But when the markets eventually do rebound, you start making that money back. And so once again, the safest way to put your money in the stock market is to spread it in a bunch of different places and then simply leave your money there. You can live off the dividends, you can let it continue to grow, all sorts of different things that you can do like that. That is the safe way. Now, unfortunately, if the safest way to invest in the stock market is to spread your money in a whole bunch of different places and then leave it there, collect dividends and let it grow over time, the most dangerous way of investing in the stock market is to put your money into one company, buy it when it's cheap, and sell it when it's high. In this manner, you're kind of gambling, almost like you would gamble at a casino whenever you're playing dice games or card games and that kind of stuff. We call this speculation. Speculation is when you buy stocks when they're low, you wait until the company's doing well, and then you sell it high. This is the most dangerous way of investing in the stock markets. You can make massive profits if you know what you're doing. If you're a day trader on Wall Street and you're doing this type of thing, you can make huge amounts of money, but keep in mind, you are taking a risk. Now, not only is speculation dangerous, but the way that they were doing it in the 1920s was in particular dangerous. If you remember last chapter when we talked about the Roaring '20s, we discussed the fact that Americans were more willing to take risks with their money in the 1920s. They seemed to have good jobs, they seemed to have stability, they seemed to have security, and so Americans were willing to buy things on credit. They were willing to buy vacuum cleaners and washing machines and refrigerators and take it out on credit or buy them with loans and all sorts of money that they didn't have. Well, if you have a culture that is being bred in the 1920s where Americans are taking risks with money that they don't necessarily have, then the stock market would seem to be as much of a risk as anything else. Particularly whenever you see the fact that the stock market is continuously rising for 8 straight years. And then during those years between 1925 and 1929, it's in fact tripling. So if you're willing to take out a loan to buy a washing machine, then why not take out a loan to purchase stocks? And so we call this buying on margin. This is when investors borrow money from brokers using only a small percentage of the down payment. They invest that money, and then when the market value grows of your stock investments, you sell it, you pay back the loan, and you keep all the extra money, and that's how you make some money off of the stock market. Once again, this is the riskiest way you could possibly be investing in the stock markets. Not only are you speculating, but you're also doing it with money that you don't have. So what we saw happening in the 1920s is as this huge bubble is being created through the market as a whole, as Americans are feeling overly confident in their economy, while it's actually leveling off and this bubble's being created, Americans are feeding that bubble with money that they don't have. And so most of the investments that were made in the 1920s were bought on margin by people who were intending on speculating. And they were getting away with it for a while as long as the stock market was continuously rising. They didn't know that at the time a massive bubble was occurring. Now, unfortunately, brokers did. And so as a result of this, as brokers were encouraging people, buy more, keep feeding the stock market. It's continuously growing up. The American economy is as good as it's ever been. It's a time to invest and all that kind of stuff. Brokers knew that at some point in time, that bubble was going to burst. And so when October 29th hit, $30 billion was lost nationwide on Black Tuesday because brokers started to panic. They were trying to sell and get out before the market hit rock bottom. They knew they had overinvested. They knew when it hit rock bottom, they were going to lose everything. And so that caused the market to drop even lower than it should have. But the problem is the person who gets left holding the bill is not necessarily the broker. And in this case, it's not necessarily even the investor, because the investor had borrowed with money they didn't have, but they had borrowed that money from the banks. And so who ends up holding the bill for everybody actually becomes the banks. Now, when we come back with our next lecture, we're going to talk about the fact that the way that the banking system was set up at the time, banks lent money to those investors. And even if you were somebody in the 1920s who said the stock market's crazy, it can't continuously rise, anything that goes up must come down, even if you were somebody who did the responsible thing and just put your money in the bank and you didn't invest, when the bank lent your money to those investors and they lost it on Black Tuesday, the biggest tragedy of all was not necessarily the people who had invested and lost, but the people who put their money in the banks for savings accounts. And then when the banks went under, the banks lost their life savings. And that's what we're going to talk about next time, how that happens.